The drought had lasted now for 10 million years, and the reign of the terrible lizards had long since ended. Here on the equator, in the continent which one day would be known as Africa, the battle for existence had reached a new climax of ferocity, and the victor was not yet in sight. In this barren and desiccated land, only the small or the swift or the fierce could flourish, or even hope to survive. The man-apes of the veldt were none of these things, and they were not flourishing. Indeed, they were already far down the road to racial extinction. About 50 of them occupied a group of caves overlooking a small parched valley, which was divided by a sluggish stream fed from snows in the mountains 200 miles to the north. In bad times, the stream vanished completely, and the tribe lived in the shadow of thirst. The tribe was always hungry, and now it was starving. When the first faint glow of dawn crept into the cave, Moonwatcher saw that his father had died in the night. He did not know that the Old One was his father, for such a relationship was utterly beyond his understanding. But as he looked at the emaciated body, he felt a dim disquiet that was the ancestor of sadness. Among his kind, Moonwatcher was almost a giant. He was nearly 5 feet high, and though badly undernourished, weighed over 100 pounds. His hairy, muscular body was halfway between ape and man, but his head was already much nearer to man than ape. The forehead was low, and there were ridges over the eye sockets, yet he unmistakably held in his genes the promise of humanity. As he looked out upon the hostile world of the Pleistocene, there was already something in his gaze beyond the capacity of any ape. In those dark, deep-set eyes was a dawning awareness, the first intimations of an intelligence that could not possibly fulfill itself for ages yet, and might soon be extinguished forever. There was no sign of danger, so Moonwatcher began to scramble down the almost vertical slope outside the cave. As if they had been waiting for his signal, the rest of the tribe emerged from their own homes further down the rock face and began to hasten towards the muddy waters of the stream for their morning drink. Moonwatcher looked across the valley to see if the others were in sight, but there was no trace of them. Perhaps they had not yet left their caves, or were already foraging further along the hillside. Since they were nowhere to be seen, Moonwatcher forgot them. He was incapable of worrying about more than one thing at a time. First, he must get rid of the body of the Old One. But this was a problem that demanded little thought. There had been many deaths this season, one of them in his own cave. He had only to put the corpse where he had left the new baby at the last quarter of the moon, and the hyenas would do the rest. When he reached the stream, the others were there. They were there every day, but that did not make it any the less annoying. There were about 30 of them, and they could not have been distinguished from the members of Moonwatcher's own tribe. As they saw him coming, they began to dance, shake their arms, and shriek on their side of the stream, and his own people replied in kind. And that was all that happened. Though the man-apes often fought and wrestled among each other, their disputes very seldom resulted in serious injuries. They had little surplus energy for such unproductive behavior. Snarling and threatening was a much more efficient way of asserting their points of view. The confrontation lasted about 5 minutes. Then the display died out as quickly as it had begun, and everyone drank his fill of the muddy water. Moonwatcher and his tribe moved off along its side of the river. The nearest worthwhile grazing was now more than a mile from the caves, and they had to share it with a herd of large antelope-like beasts who barely tolerated their presence. They could not be driven away, for they were armed with ferocious daggers on their foreheads. So Moonwatcher and his companions chewed berries and fruit and leaves and fought off the pangs of hunger, while all around them, competing for the same fodder, was a source of more food than they could ever hope to eat. Yet the meat roaming over the savannah was not only beyond their reach, it was beyond their imagination. In the midst of plenty, they were slowly starving to death. Over the valley a full moon was rising, and a chill wind was blowing down from the distant mountains. It would be very cold tonight. But cold, like hunger, was not a matter for any real concern. It was merely part of the background of life. Moonwatcher barely stirred when the shrieks and screams echoed up the slope from one of the lower caves, and he did not need to hear the occasional growl of the leopard to know exactly what was happening. Down there in the darkness, old Whitehair and his family were fighting and dying, and the thought that he might help in some way never crossed Moonwatcher's mind. The harsh logic of survival ruled out such fancies, and not a voice was raised in protest from the listening hillside. Every cave was silent, lest it also attract disaster. The tumult died away. Then the leopard got a good hold on its kill, carrying its victim effortlessly in its jaws. Moonwatcher crawled out of the cave, clambered onto a large boulder beside the entrance, and squatted there to survey the valley. Of all the creatures who had yet walked on earth, the man-apes were the first to look steadfastly at the moon. And though he could not remember it, when he was very young, Moonwatcher would sometimes reach out and try to touch that ghostly face rising above the hills. Once or twice he dozed off, but he slept with a hair-trigger alertness, and the slightest sound would have disturbed him. At the great age of 25, he was still in full possession of all his faculties. If his luck continued, and he avoided accidents, disease, predators, and starvation, he might survive for as much as another 10 years. The night wore on, cold and clear, without further alarms, and the moon rose slowly amid equatorial constellations that no human eye would ever see. And twice there passed, slowly across the sky, rising up the zenith and descending into the east, a dazzling point of light, more brilliant than any star. Late that night, Moonwatcher suddenly awoke. Fear crept slowly into his soul. Never in his life had he heard a sound like this. It seemed that some enormous beast was moving through the night, making no attempt at concealment and ignoring obstacles. And then there came a sound which Moonwatcher could not possibly have identified, for it had never been heard before in the history of the world. It was the clank of metal upon stone. Moonwatcher came face to face with a new rock when he led the tribe down to the river in the first light of morning. It was a rectangular slab, 3 times his height, but narrow enough to span with his arms, and it was made of some completely transparent material. Indeed, it was not easy to see, except when the rising sun glinted on its edges. As Moonwatcher had never encountered ice or even crystal-clear water, there were no natural objects to which he could compare this apparition. It was certainly attractive, and though he was wisely cautious of most new things, he did not hesitate for long before sidling up to it. As nothing happened, he put out his hand and felt a cold, hard surface. After several minutes of intense thought, he arrived at a brilliant explanation. It was a rock, of course, and it must have grown during the night. There were many plants that did this, white, pulpy things shaped like pebbles that seemed to shoot up during the hours of darkness. A few licks and nibbles quickly disillusioned him that it might be edible. There was no nourishment here. So, like a sensible man-ape, he continued on his way to the river and forgot all about it. The foraging today was very bad, and the tribe had to travel several miles from the caves to find food at all. On the homeward trek, looking round anxiously for early hunters, they drank hastily at the stream and started to climb up to their caves. They were still 100 yards from the new rock when the sound began. It stopped them dead, so that they stood paralyzed on the trail, with their jaws hanging slackly. A simple, maddening, repetitious vibration, it pulsed out from the crystal and hypnotized all who came within its spell. And as the shadows lengthened and the light drained from the sky, the monolith lost its transparency and became suffused with a pale, milky luminescence. Tantalizing, ill-defined phantoms moved across its surface and in its depths. They coalesced into bars of light and shadow, then formed intermeshing spoked patterns that began slowly to rotate. Now, utterly hypnotized, the man-apes could only stare into this astonishing display of pyrotechnics. They could never guess that their minds were being probed, their bodies mapped, their reactions studied, their potentials evaluated. At first the whole tribe remained half-crouching in a motionless tableau, as if frozen into stone. Then the man-ape nearest the slab suddenly came to life, as if it were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The head turned this way and that. The mouth silently opened and closed. The hands clenched and unclenched. Then he bent down, snapped off a long stalk of grass, and attempted to tie it into a knot with clumsy fingers. Despite all his efforts, he succeeded only in breaking the stalk in pieces. As the fragments fell to the ground, the controlling influence left him, and he froze once more into immobility. Another man-ape came to life and went through the same routine. This was a younger, more adaptable specimen. It succeeded where the older one had failed. On the planet Earth, the first crude knot had been tied. When Moonwatcher's turn came, he felt very little fear. Without knowing why, he bent down and picked up a small stone. When he straightened up, he saw that there was a new image in the crystal slab. The grids and the moving, dancing patterns had gone. Instead, there was a series of concentric circles surrounding a small black disk. Obeying the silent orders in his brain, he pitched the stone with a clumsy overarm throw. It missed the target by several feet. "Try again," said the command. At the fourth attempt, he was only inches from the central bullseye. A feeling of indescribable pleasure, almost sexual in its intensity, flooded his mind. Then the control relaxed. He felt no impulse to do anything except to stand and wait. One by one, every member of the tribe was briefly possessed. Some succeeded, but most failed at the tasks they had been set, and all were appropriately rewarded by spasms of pleasure or of pain. Now there was only a uniform, featureless glow in the great slab, so that it stood like a block of light superimposed on the surrounding darkness. As if waking from a sleep, the man-apes shook their heads and presently began to move along the trail to their place of shelter. They did not look back, or wonder at the strange light that was guiding them to their homes, and to a future unknown as yet, even to the stars. The man-apes had no recollections of what they had seen after the monolith had ceased to cast its hypnotic spell. The next day, as they went out to forage, they passed it with scarcely a second thought. They could not eat it, and it could not eat them. Therefore it was not important. That night the slab was still waiting, again surrounded by its pulsating aura of light and sound. Some of the man-apes ignored it completely, but the crystal monolith was patient. Neither it nor its replicas scattered across half the globe expected to succeed with all the scores of groups involved in the experiment. 100 failures would not matter, when a single success could change the destiny of the world. So night after night, Moonwatcher stared at the crystal monolith with unblinking eyes, while his brain lay open to its still uncertain manipulations. Often he felt nausea, but always he felt hunger, and from time to time his hands clenched unconsciously in the patterns that would determine his new way of life. By the time of the next new moon, Moonwatcher and his tribe had seen 1 birth and 2 deaths. One of these had been due to starvation. The other had occurred during the nightly ritual, when a man-ape, hypnotized by the monolith, had suddenly collapsed while attempting to tap 2 pieces of stone delicately together. At once the crystal slab had darkened, and the tribe had been released from its spell. But the fallen man-ape had not moved, and by morning, of course, the body was gone. There had been no performance the next night. The monolith was still analyzing its mistake. The tribe streamed past it through the gathering dusk, ignoring its presence completely. The night after, it was ready for them again. The man-apes must adapt, or they must die, like the greater beasts who had walked the earth not so long before them, and whose bones now lay sealed within the limestone hills. As the line of warthogs moved snuffling and grunting across the trail, Moonwatcher came to a sudden halt. Pigs and man-apes had always ignored each other, for there was no conflict of interest between them. Like most animals that did not compete for the same food, they merely kept out of each other's way. Yet now Moonwatcher stood looking at them, wavering back and forth uncertainly as he was buffeted by impulses which he could not understand. Then, as if in a dream, he started searching the ground, though for what he could not have explained, even if he had the power of speech. He would recognize it when he saw it. It was a heavy, pointed stone about 6 inches long, and though it did not fit his hand perfectly, it would do. As he swung his hand around, puzzled by its sudden increased weight, he felt a pleasing sense of power and authority. He started to move towards the nearest pig. It was a young and foolish animal, even by the undemanding standards of warthog intelligence. Though it observed him out of the corner of its eye, it did not take him seriously until much too late. Why should it suspect these harmless creatures of any evil intent? It went on rooting up the grass until Moonwatcher's stone hammer obliterated its dim consciousness. The remainder of the herd continued grazing unalarmed, for the murder had been swift and silent. All the other man-apes in the group had stopped to watch. Presently, one of them picked up the blood-stained weapon and began to pound the dead pig. Others joined in with any sticks and stones that they could gather, until their target began a messy disintegration. Then they became bored. Some wandered off, while others stood hesitantly around the unrecognizable corpse, the future of a world waiting upon their decision. It was a surprisingly long time before one of the nursing females began to lick the gory stone she was holding in her paws. And it was longer still before Moonwatcher, despite all that he had been shown, really understood that he need never be hungry again. Moons waxed and waned. Babies were born and sometimes lived. Feeble, toothless 30-year-olds died. The others threatened daily across the river, but now the tribe prospered. The very memory of hunger was fading from their minds. They had time both for leisure and for the first rudiments of thought. Their new way of life was now casually accepted, and they did not associate it in any way with the monolith still standing beside the trail to the river. But no utopia is perfect, and this one had 2 blemishes. The first was the marauding leopard, whose passion for man-apes seemed to have grown even stronger now that they were better nourished. The second was the tribe across the river, for somehow the others had survived and had stubbornly refused to die of starvation. The tribe still experienced occasional bad days, though these no longer threatened its very survival. Towards dusk, it had failed to make a kill. The home caves were already in sight as Moonwatcher led his tired and disgruntled companions back to shelter. And there, on their very threshold, they found one of nature's rare bonanzas. A full-grown antelope was lying by the trail. Its foreleg was broken, but it still had plenty of fight in it, and the circling jackals gave its dagger-like horns a respectful berth. They retreated with angry snarls when the man-apes arrived. Moonwatcher and his companions circled warily, keeping beyond the range of those dangerous horns. Then they moved to the attack with clubs and stones. It was not a very effective or coordinated attack. By the time the wretched beast had been given its quietus, the light had almost gone, and the jackals were regaining their courage. Moonwatcher, torn between fear and hunger, slowly realized that all this effort might have been in vain. It was too dangerous to stay here any longer. Then, not for the first or the last time, he proved himself a genius. With an immense effort of imagination, he visualized the dead antelope in the safety of his own cave. He began to drag it toward the cliff face. Presently, the others understood his intentions and began to help him. Finally, it was done. The battered antelope was dragged over the lip of the cave as the last hues of sunlight faded from the sky, and the feasting began. Hours later, gorged to repletion, Moonwatcher awoke. Not knowing why, he sat up in the darkness among the sprawled bodies of his equally satiated companions and strained his ears into the night. Then, from a long way off, came the sound of a falling pebble. Fearful, yet inquisitive, Moonwatcher crawled out onto the ledge of the cave and peered down the face of the cliff. What he saw left him so paralyzed with fright that for long seconds he was unable to move. Only 20 feet below, two gleaming golden eyes were staring straight up at him. They held him so hypnotized with fear that he was scarcely aware of the lithe, streaked body behind them, flowing smoothly and silently from rock to rock. Never before had the leopard climbed so high. It was following the spoor of blood up the moon-washed face of the cliff. It reached the ledge and rested for a moment on the narrow open space. The scented blood was all around, filling its fierce and tiny mind with one overwhelming desire. Without hesitation, it padded silently into the cave. And here it made its first error. The man-apes could see it, partly silhouetted against the opening of the cave, more clearly than it could see them. Desperation had given them courage to attempt the impossible, and for the first time, they had the means to achieve it. The leopard knew that something was wrong when it felt a stunning blow on its head. It lashed out with its forepaw and heard a shriek of agony as its claws slashed through soft flesh. Then there was a piercing pain as something sharp drove into its flanks, once, twice, and yet a third time. It whirled around to strike at the shadows, screaming and dancing on all sides. And then it made its second mistake, for in its surprise and fright, it had forgotten where it was. Or perhaps it had been dazed or blinded by the blows rained on its head. Whatever the reason, it bolted abruptly from the cave. There was a horrible screech as it went toppling out into space. Ages later, it seemed, there came a thud as it crashed into an outcropping halfway down the cliff. Thereafter, the only sound was the sliding of loose stones, which quickly died away into the night. For a long time, intoxicated by victory, Moonwatcher stood dancing and gibbering at the entrance of the cave. He rightly sensed that his whole world had changed, and that he was no longer a powerless victim of the forces around him. Then he went back into the cave, and for the first time in his life, had an unbroken night's sleep. As he led the tribe down to the river in the dim light of dawn, Moonwatcher paused uncertainly at a familiar spot. Something, he knew, was missing, but what it was he could not remember. He wasted no mental effort on the problem, for this morning he had more important matters on his mind. From their side of the stream and the never-violated safety of their own territory, the others first saw Moonwatcher and a dozen males of his tribe as a moving frieze against the dawn sky. At once they began to scream their daily challenge, but this time there was no answer. Their leader, a one-eared man-ape of Moonwatcher's size and age, but in poorer condition, even made a brief foray towards the tribe's territory, screaming loudly and waving his arms in an attempt to scare the opposition and to bolster his own courage. The water of the stream was nowhere more than a foot deep, but the further One Ear moved out into it, the more uncertain and unhappy he became. Very soon he slowed to a halt, and then moved back with exaggerated dignity to rejoin his companions. Steadily, purposefully, above all silently, Moonwatcher and his band descended the low hillock that overlooked the river, and as they approached, the others became suddenly quiet. Their ritual rage ebbed away, to be replaced by mounting fear. They were dimly aware that something had happened, and that this encounter was unlike all those that had ever gone before. The bone clubs and knives that Moonwatcher's group carried did not alarm them, for they did not understand their purpose. They only knew that their rivals' movements were now imbued with determination and with menace. Moonwatcher raised his arms high into the air, revealing the burden that until now had been concealed by the hirsute bodies of his companions. He was holding a stout branch, and impaled upon it was the bloody head of the leopard. Holding the mangled trophy above his head, he started to cross the stream. After a moment's hesitation, his companions splashed after him. When Moonwatcher reached the far side, One Ear was still standing his ground. Perhaps he was too brave or too stupid to run. Perhaps he could not really believe that this outrage was actually happening. Coward or hero, it made no difference in the end, as the frozen snarl of death came crashing down upon his uncomprehending head. Shrieking with fright, the others scattered into the bush. But presently they would return, and soon they would forget their lost leader. For a few seconds, Moonwatcher stood uncertainly above his new victim, trying to grasp the strange and wonderful fact that the dead leopard could kill again. Now he was master of the world, and he was not quite sure what to do next. But he would think of something. A new animal was abroad on the planet, spreading slowly out from the African heartland. In the 100,000 years since the crystals had descended upon Africa, the man-apes had started to change and had developed skills which no other animal possessed. Their massive teeth were growing smaller, for they were no longer essential. The sharp-edged stones that could be used to dig out roots or to cut and saw through tough flesh or fiber had begun to replace them with immeasurable consequences. No longer were the man-apes faced with starvation when their teeth became damaged or worn. Even the crudest tools could add many years to their lives. And as their fangs diminished, the shape of their faces started to alter. The snout receded, the massive jaws became more delicate, the mouth able to make more subtle sounds. And somewhere in the shadowy centuries, they invented the most essential tool of all, though it could be neither seen nor touched. They had learned to speak, and so had won their first great victory over time. Now the knowledge of one generation could be handed on to the next, so that each age could profit from those that had gone before. Man had acquired a past, and he was beginning to grope towards a future. Speech became eternal, thanks to certain marks on stone and papyrus. Presently he invented philosophy and religion, and he peopled the sky, not altogether inaccurately, with gods. As his body became more and more defenseless, so his means of offense became steadily more frightful. Having run the gamut of everything that could pierce and slash, he had learned how to strike down his victims from a distance. The spear, the bow, the gun, and finally the guided missile had given him weapons of infinite range and all but infinite power. Into them he had put his heart and soul, and for ages they had served him well. But now, as long as they existed, he was living on borrowed time. No matter how many times you left Earth, Dr. Heywood Floyd told himself, the excitement never really paled. He had been to Mars once, to the Moon 3 times, and to the various space stations more often than he could remember. Yet as the moment of takeoff approached, he was conscious of a rising tension, a feeling of wonder and awe, yes, and of nervousness, which put him on the same level as any Earth-lover about to receive his first baptism of space. Though it was 2 o'clock in the morning, a group of reporters and cameramen had intercepted him on his way to the floodlit Orion 3 spacecraft. He knew several of them by sight, for as chairman of the National Council of Astronautics, the news conference was part of his way of life. Dr. Floyd, I'm Jim Forster of Associated News. Could you give us a few words about this flight of yours? I'm very sorry I can't say anything. But you did meet with the president earlier this evening, asked a familiar voice. Oh, hello, Mike. I'm afraid you've been dragged out of bed for nothing. Definitely no comment. Can you at least confirm or deny that some kind of epidemic has broken out on the moon? A TV reporter asked, managing to jog alongside and keep Floyd properly framed in his miniature TV camera. What about the quarantine? Asked another reporter. How long will it be kept on? Still no comment. Dr. Floyd, demanded a very short and determined lady of the press, what possible justification can there be for this total blackout of news from the moon? Has it anything to do with the political situation? What political situation? Floyd asked dryly. There was a sprinkling of laughter as he made his way into the sanctuary of the boarding gantry. As long as he could remember, it had not been a situation so much as a permanent crisis. With the need for international cooperation more urgent than ever, there were still as many frontiers as in any earlier age. In 1,000,000 years, the human race had lost few of its aggressive instincts. Along symbolic lines visible only to politicians, the nuclear powers watched each other with belligerent anxiety. Between them, they possessed sufficient megatonnage to remove the entire surface crust of the planet. Although there had been, miraculously, no use of atomic weapons, this situation could hardly last forever. Every time Floyd took off from Earth, He wondered if it would still be there when the time came to return. The trim stewardess greeted him as he entered the cabin. "Good morning, Dr. Floyd. I'm Miss Simmons. I'd like to welcome you aboard on behalf of Captain Tynes and our co-pilot First Officer Ballard. Our transit time will be 55 minutes. Maximum acceleration will be 2G, and we will be weightless for 30 minutes. Please do not leave your seat until the safety light is lit." He leaned back into his seat and relaxed. This trip, he calculated, would cost the taxpayers slightly over $1 million. If it was not justified, he would be out of his job. But he could always go back to the university and to his interrupted studies of planetary formation. It was hard to tell when they lifted from the track and became airborne, but when the roar of the rocket suddenly doubled its fury and Floyd found himself sinking deeper and deeper into the cushions of his seat, he knew that the first stage engines had taken over. Yet there was no discomfort. Indeed, the pressure of acceleration and the overwhelming thunder of the motors produced an extraordinary euphoria. Floyd felt more alive than he had for years. He was young again. He wanted to sing aloud, which was certainly safe, for no one could possibly hear him. The mood passed swiftly as he suddenly realized that he was leaving Earth and everything he had ever loved. Down there were his 3 children, motherless since his wife had taken that fatal flight to Europe 10 years ago. Perhaps, for their sake, he should have remarried. Weight was slowly ebbing. The rockets were being throttled back as the ship eased itself into orbit. The thunder of the engines dropped to a muted roar, then a gentle hiss, then died into silence. If it had not been for the restraining straps, Floyd would have floated out of his seat. His stomach felt as if it were going to do so anyway. The stewardess came walking up the narrow corridor to the right of the closely spaced seats. There was a slight buoyancy about her steps, and her feet came away from the floor reluctantly, as if entangled in glue. She was keeping to the bright yellow band of Velcro carpeting that ran the full length of the floor and of the ceiling. The carpet and the soles of her sandals were covered with myriads of tiny hooks, so that they clung together like burrs. This trick of walking in free fall was immensely reassuring to disoriented passengers. "Would you like some coffee or tea, Dr. Floyd?" she asked cheerfully. "No, thank you," he smiled. He always felt like a baby when he had to suck at one of those plastic drinking tubes. The stewardess was still hovering anxiously around him as he popped open his briefcase and prepared to remove his papers. "Dr. Floyd, may I ask you a question?" "Certainly," he answered, looking up over his glasses. "My fiancé is a geologist at Tycho," said Miss Simmons, measuring her words carefully, "and I haven't heard from him for over a week." "I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe he's away from his base and out of touch." She shook her head. "He always tells me when that's going to happen, and you can imagine how worried I am with all these rumors. Is it really true about an epidemic on the moon?" "If it is, there's no cause for alarm. Remember, there was a quarantine back in '98 over that mutated flu virus. A lot of people were sick, but no one died. And that's really all I can say," he concluded firmly. Miss Simmons smiled pleasantly and straightened up. "Well, thank you anyway, Doctor. I'm sorry to have bothered you." "No bother at all," he said gallantly, but not very accurately. Then he buried himself in his endless technical reports in a desperate last-minute assault on the usual backlog. He would have no time for reading when he got to the moon. Half an hour later, the pilot announced, "We make contact in 10 minutes. Please check your seat harness." Floyd caught his first glimpse of Space Station 1 only a few miles away. The sunlight glinted and sparkled from the polished metal surfaces of the slowly revolving 300-yard diameter disk. Not far away, drifting in the same orbit, was a swept-back T-Top 5 spaceplane, and close to that an almost spherical Ares 1B, the workhorse of space, with the 4 stubby legs of its lunar landing shock absorbers jutting from one side. The central axis of the space station, with its docking arms extended, was not rotating, or rather, it was running in reverse at a rate which exactly countered the station's own spin. Thus, a visiting spacecraft could be coupled to it for the transfer of personnel or cargo without being whirled disastrously around. With the softest of thuds, ship and station made contact. A few seconds later, the airlock door opened, and a man wearing the light, close-fitting slacks and short-sleeved shirt, which was almost the uniform of space station personnel, came into the cabin. "Pleased to meet you, Dr. Floyd. I'm Nick Miller, station security. I'm to look after you until the shuttle leaves." Very cautiously, it was more than a year since he had last been weightless, and it would be some time before he regained his space legs, Floyd hauled himself hand over hand through the airlock and into the large circular chamber at the axis of the space station. It was a heavily padded room, its walls covered with recessed handholds. Floyd gripped one of these firmly, while the whole chamber started to rotate until it matched the spin of the station. As it gained speed, faint and ghostly gravitational fingers began to clutch at him, and he drifted slowly towards the circular wall. Now he was standing on what had magically become a curving floor. The centrifugal force of the station's spin had taken hold of him. It was very feeble here, so near the axis, but would increase steadily as he moved outwards. From the central transit chamber, he followed Miller down a curving stair. Not until he reached the passenger lounge on the outer skin of the great revolving disc had he acquired enough weight to move around almost normally. The lounge had been redecorated since his last visit. Besides the usual chairs, small tables, restaurant, and post office, there was now a drugstore, movie theater, and souvenir shop. "Can I get you anything while we're waiting?" Miller asked. "We board in about 30 minutes. "I could do with a cup of black coffee, 2 lumps, and I'd like to call Earth." "Right, Doctor, I'll get the coffee. The phones are over there." Floyd, after checking that the area code for the U.S. was the same, punched his 12-digit home number, dropped his plastic all-purpose credit card into the pay slot, and was through in seconds. Washington was still sleeping, for it was several hours to dawn, but he would not disturb anyone. His housekeeper would get the message from the recorder as soon as she awoke. "Miss Fleming, this is Dr. Floyd. Sorry I had to leave in such a hurry. Would you please call my office and ask them to collect the car? It's at Dulles Airport, and the key is with Mr. Bailey, Senior Flight Control Officer. Give my love to the children and say I'll be back as soon as I can. Oh, hell, there's someone I don't want to see. I'll call from the moon if I can. Goodbye." Floyd tried to duck out of the booth, but it was too late. He had already been spotted. Bearing down on him through the Soviet section exit was Dr. Dmitry Moiseyevich of the USSR Academy of Science. Dmitry was one of Floyd's best friends, and for that very reason he was the last person he wished to talk to here and now. The Russian astronomer was tall, slender, and blond, and his unlined face belied his 55 years, the last 10 of which had been spent building up the giant radio observatory on the far side of the moon, where 2,000 miles of solid rock would shield it from the electronic racket of Earth. "Why, Haywood," he said, shaking hands firmly, "it's a small universe. I suppose you're on your way up?" Yes, my flight leaves in half an hour," answered Floyd. "Do you know Mr. Miller?" The security officer had now approached and was standing at a respectful distance holding a plastic cup full of coffee. "Of course. But please put that down, Mr. Miller. This is Dr. Floyd's last chance to have a civilized drink. Let's not waste it. No, I insist." They followed Dmitri out of the main lounge into the observation section, and soon were sitting at a table under a dim light, watching the moving panorama of the stars. "Now," said Dmitri, after he had swiftly downed his first drink, "what's all this about an epidemic in the U.S. sector?" Floyd groaned inwardly. "The quarantine is purely a safety precaution," he said cautiously. "We're not even sure it's really necessary, but we don't believe in taking chances." Said Moiseyevich, obviously quite unconvinced. "Seems odd to me that you, an astronomer, should be sent up to the moon to look into an epidemic." "I'm an ex-astronomer. It's years since I did any real research. Now I'm a scientific expert. That means I know nothing about absolutely everything." "Then do you know what TMA-1 means?" Miller seemed about to choke on his drink, but Floyd was made of sterner stuff. He looked at his old friend straight in the eye and said calmly, "TMA-1? What an odd expression. Where did you hear it?" "Never mind," retorted the Russian. "You can't fool me. But if you've run into something you can't handle, I hope you don't leave it until too late before you yell for help." Miller looked meaningfully at his watch. "Due to board in 5 minutes, Dr. Floyd," he said. "I think we'd better get moving." Though he knew that they still had a good 20 minutes, Floyd got up with haste. Too much haste, for he had forgotten the 1/6 gravity. He grabbed the table just in time to prevent a takeoff. "It was fine meeting you, Dmitri," he said, not quite accurately. "Hope you have a good trip down to Earth. I'll give you a call as soon as I'm back." As they left the lounge and checked through the U.S. transit barrier, Floyd remarked, "Whew, that was close. Thanks for rescuing me." "You know, Doctor," said the security officer, "I hope he isn't right." "Right about what?" "About us running into something we can't handle." "That," Floyd answered with determination, "is what I intend to find out." The Ares 1B lunar carrier pulled away from the space station orbiting Earth. The cabin Heywood Floyd had all to himself had been designed for 30 passengers. He doubted that any man in history had ever received such exclusive service, and that it was most unlikely that anyone would do so in the future. There was plenty to occupy his time, even if he did nothing but sit and read. From time to time, the captain and the other members of the crew came into the cabin and exchanged a few words with him. They treated their distinguished passenger with awe, and were doubtless burning with curiosity about his mission, but were too polite to ask any questions or even to drop any hints. There was one sleep period, and when he awoke, Floyd saw the moon had swallowed up half the sky, and the braking maneuvers were about to begin. Gradually, a single giant crater filled the field of view. As its ramparts slipped below the horizon, the smaller craterlets that peppered its interior were beginning to disclose their real size. Abruptly, a swirling cloud of dust hid everything. The jets gave one final spurt, and the shuttle rocked very slightly like a rowboat when a small wave goes by. It was some minutes before Floyd could really accept the silence that now enfolded him and the weak gravity that gripped his limbs. He had made, utterly without incident, and in little more than a day, the incredible journey of which men had dreamed for 2,000 years. After a normal routine flight, he had landed on the moon. A small bus with an extension tube like a stubby elephant trunk was now nuzzling affectionately up against the spacecraft. A few seconds later, the inner door of the airlock opened, and the welcoming delegation entered. It was led by Ralph Halverson, the administrator of the southern province, which meant not only the base, but also any exploring parties that operated from it. With him was his chief scientist, Dr. Roy Michaels, a grizzled geophysicist whom Floyd knew from previous visits, and half a dozen senior scientists and executives. They greeted him with respectful relief. From the administrator downwards, it was obvious that they looked forward to a chance of unloading some of their worries. "Very pleased to have you with us, Dr. Floyd," said Halverson. "Did you have a good trip?" "Excellent," Floyd answered. "It couldn't have been better. The crew looked after me very well." By unspoken agreement, no one mentioned the reason for his visit. After traveling 1,000 feet from the landing site, the bus dived into a cutting, which took it quickly below ground level. A massive door opened ahead, then closed behind them. This happened again, and yet a third time. When the last door had closed, there was a great roaring of air, and they were back in atmosphere once more, in the shirt-sleeve environment of the base. The briefing took place in a large rectangular chamber that could hold 100 people with ease. Floyd walked to the rostrum amid a sprinkling of polite applause, surveyed the audience with a smile, and said, "Thank you. I only want to say this. The President has asked me to convey his appreciation of your outstanding work, which we hope the world will soon be able to recognize. I'm quite aware," he continued carefully, "that some of you, perhaps most of you, are anxious that the present veil of secrecy be withdrawn. But I would remind you that this is a quite extraordinary situation. If we make errors now, there may be no second chance, so please be patient a little longer. Those are also the wishes of the President. That's all I have to say. Now I'm ready for your report." He walked back to his seat. The administrator said, "Thank you very much, Dr. Floyd," and nodded to his chief scientist. On cue, Dr. Michaels walked up to the rostrum and the lights faded out. A photograph of the moon flashed onto the screen. At the very center of the disk was a brilliant white crater ring, from which a striking pattern of rays fanned out. It looked exactly as if someone had hurled a bag of flour at the face of the moon, and it had scattered out in all directions. "On this vertical photograph," said Michaels, pointing to the central crater, "Tycho is even more conspicuous than when seen from Earth. Then it's rather near the edge of the moon. During the past year, we have been conducting a magnetic survey of the region from a low-level satellite. It was completed only last month, and this is the result, the map that started all the trouble." Another picture flashed on the screen. It looked like a contour map, though it showed magnetic intensity, not height above sea level. For the most part, the lines were roughly parallel and spaced well apart, but in one corner of the map they became suddenly packed together to form a series of concentric circles, like a drawing of a knothole on a piece of wood. Even to an untrained eye, it was obvious that something peculiar had happened to the moon's magnetic field in this region, and in large letters across the bottom of the map were the words, "Tycho Magnetic Anomaly 1, TMA1. Stamped on the top right was "Classified." "At first we thought it might be an outcrop of magnetic rock, but all the geological evidence was against it, so we sent out a survey party to have a look. What they found brought them back to base in a hurry. We sent out a bigger team with better equipment. They excavated for 2 weeks, with the result you know." The darkened assembly room became suddenly hushed and expectant as the picture on the screen changed. On Earth and Moon, less than 100 people had so far been allowed to set eyes on this photograph. It showed a man in a bright red and yellow spacesuit standing at the bottom of an excavation and supporting a surveyor's rod marked off in tenths of a meter. The object before which the spacesuited man was posing was a vertical slab of jet-black material about 10 feet high and 5 feet wide. It reminded Floyd somewhat ominously of a giant tombstone. Perfectly sharp-edged and symmetrical, there was no surface detail at all. It was impossible to tell whether it was made of stone or metal or plastic, or some material altogether unknown to man. "TMA1, Dr. Michaels declared almost reverently. "It looks brand new, doesn't it? I can hardly blame those who were trying to connect it with the third Chinese expedition back in '98. But I never believed that, and now we've been able to date it positively from local geological evidence. My colleagues and I, Dr. Floyd, will stake our reputations on this. TMA1 has nothing to do with the Chinese. Indeed, it has nothing to do with the human race, for when it was buried, there were no humans. You see, it is approximately 3 million years old. What you are now looking at is the first evidence of intelligent life beyond the Earth." The mobile lab, now rolling across the crater plain at 50 miles an hour, looked rather like an outsized trailer mounted on 8 flex wheels. But it was very much more than this. Indeed, it was virtually a land-going spaceship, and in an emergency it could even fly. As he sat with Halverson and Michaels in the forward observation lounge immediately beneath the driver's position, Floyd found his thoughts turning again and again to the 3 million year wide gulf that had just opened up before him. 3 million years. Not only man himself, but most of the animals now alive on Earth did not even exist when the black enigma was so carefully buried here in the most brilliant and most spectacular of all the craters of the moon. That it had been buried, and quite deliberately, Dr. Michaels was absolutely sure. Excavations revealed it was sitting on a wide platform of the same black material, with undisturbed rock beneath it. At last, one of man's oldest questions had been answered. Here was the proof, beyond all shadow of doubt, that his was not the only intelligence that the universe had brought forth. But with that knowledge, there came again an aching awareness of the immensity of time. Whatever had passed this way had missed mankind by 100,000 generations. Perhaps, Floyd told himself, it was just as well. There was certainly little agreement anywhere about the nature of TMA1. Shrine, survey marker, tomb, geophysical instrument. These were perhaps the favorite suggestions. and some of the protagonists grew very heated in their defense. So far, the hard black material of the monolith had resisted all the rather mild attempts that Michaels and his colleagues had made to obtain samples. The decision to employ violent measures would be left to Floyd. He had already decided that all possible non-destructive means of investigation would be brought into play before he called up the heavy artillery. It was the mark of a barbarian to destroy something one could not understand, but perhaps men were barbarians beside the creatures who had made this thing. And where could they have come from? All the evidence was against intelligent life elsewhere in the solar system, or indeed life of any kind except on Earth and perhaps Mars. The inner planets were too hot, the outer ones far too cold. So perhaps these visitors had come from the stars. Yet that was even more incredible. Floyd remembered how often his fellow scientists had proved that interstellar travel was impossible. The journey from Earth to Moon was still fairly impressive, but the very nearest star was 100 million times more distant. Speculation was a waste of time. He must wait until there was more evidence. They were descending one of the inner terraces of Tycho, and had leveled out again some 1,000 feet below. As they crawled down the slope, Michaels pointed out across the great expanse of plain now spread out beneath them. "You can just see the crater," said Michaels. "Over there on the right, about 100 yards from that radio antenna." So this is it, thought Floyd, as the bus began to creep cautiously down a ramp of hard-packed rock into the interior of the crater. And there, exactly as he had seen it in the photographs, was TMA-1. Floyd stared, blinked, shook his head, and stared again. Even in the brilliant Earthlight, it was hard to see the object clearly. His first impression was a flat rectangle that might have been cut out of carbon paper. It seemed to have no thickness at all. Of course, this was an optical illusion. Though he was looking at a solid body, it reflected so little light that he could see it only in silhouette. The bus came to a halt within 20 feet of the slab. At some signal, floodlights around the lip of the crater were switched on, centered on the monolith, and where they touched it, its ebon surface seemed to swallow them. Pandora's box, thought Floyd with a sudden sense of foreboding, waiting to be opened by inquisitive man. And what will he find inside? Clad in a spacesuit, Floyd walked slowly down the ramp towards the black rectangle, feeling a sense not only of awe but of helplessness. Here, at the very portals of Earth, man was already face to face with a mystery that might never be solved. 3 million years ago, something had passed this way, had left this unknown and perhaps unknowable symbol of its purpose, and had returned to the planets or to the stars. Now the sluggish sun had lifted itself above the edge of the crater, and its rays were pouring almost broadside upon the eastern side of the block, yet it seemed to absorb every particle of light as if it had never been. Floyd decided to try a simple experiment. He stood between the monolith and the sun and looked for his own shadow on the smooth black sheet. There was no trace of it. How strange, he thought, to stand here while this thing is seeing daylight for the first time since the Ice Age began on Earth. He wondered again about its black color. That was ideal, of course, for absorbing solar energy. But he dismissed the thought at once, for who would be crazy enough to bury a sun-powered device 20 feet underground? Floyd was still musing when his helmet speaker suddenly emitted a piercing electronic shriek, like a hideously overloaded and distorted time signal. Involuntarily, he tried to block his ears with his spacesuited hands. Then he recovered and groped frantically for the gain control of his receiver. While he was still fumbling, 4 more of the shrieks blasted out of the ether. Then there was a merciful silence. All around the crater, figures were standing in attitudes of paralyzed astonishment. So it's nothing wrong with my suit radio, Floyd told himself. Everyone heard those piercing electronic screams. After 3 million years of darkness, TMA-1 had greeted the lunar dawn. The ship was still only 30 days from Earth, yet David Bowman sometimes found it hard to believe that he had ever known any other existence than the closed little world of Discovery. All his years of training, all his earlier missions to the Moon and Mars, seemed to belong to another man in another life. Frank Poole admitted to the same feelings, and had sometimes jokingly regretted that the nearest psychiatrist was the better part of 100 million miles away. But this sense of isolation and estrangement was easy enough to understand, and certainly indicated no abnormality. In the 50 years since men had ventured into space, there had never been a mission quite like this. It had begun 5 years ago as Project Jupiter, the first manned round trip to the greatest of the planets. The ship was nearly ready for the 2-year voyage when, somewhat abruptly, the mission profile had been changed. Discovery would still go to Jupiter, but she would not stop there. She would not even slacken speed as she raced through the far-ranging Jovian satellite system. On the contrary, she would use the gravitational field of the giant world as a sling, to cast her even further from the sun. Like a comet, she would streak on across the outer reaches of the solar system to her ultimate goal, the ringed glory of Saturn. And she would never return. For Discovery, it would be a one-way trip. Yet her crew had no intention of committing suicide. If all went well, they would be back on Earth within 7 years, 5 of which would pass like a flash in the dreamless sleep of hibernation, while they waited rescue by the still unbuilt Discovery 2. The word rescue was carefully avoided in all the Astronautics Agency's statements and documents. It implied some failure of planning, and the approved jargon was reacquisition. If anything went really wrong, there would certainly be no hope of rescue, almost 1 billion miles from Earth. It was a calculated risk, like all voyages into the unknown, but half a century of research had proved that artificially induced human hibernation was perfectly safe, and it had opened up new possibilities in space travel. Not until this mission, however, had they been exploited to their utmost. The 3 members of the survey team who would not be needed until the ship entered her final orbit around Saturn would sleep through the entire outward flight. Tons of food and other expendables would thus be saved. Almost as important, the team would be fresh and alert, and not fatigued by the 10-month voyage when they went into action. Discovery would enter a parking orbit around Saturn, becoming a new moon of the giant planet. She would swing back and forth along a 2-million-mile ellipse that took her close to Saturn and then across the orbits of all its major moons. They would have 100 days in which to map and study a world with 80 times the area of Earth and surrounded by a retinue of at least 15 known satellites, one of them as large as the planet Mercury. At the end of the 100 days, Discovery would close down. All the crew would go into hibernation. Only the essential systems would continue to operate, watched over by the ship's tireless electronic brain. She would continue to swing around Saturn on an orbit now so well determined that men would know exactly where to look for her 1,000 years hence. But in only 5 years, according to present plans, Discovery 2 would come. Even if 6 or 7 or 8 years elapsed, her sleeping passengers would never know the difference. For all of them, the clock would have stopped, as it had stopped already for Whitehead, Kaminsky, and Hunter. Sometimes Bowman, as first captain of Discovery, envied his 3 unconscious colleagues in the frozen peace of the hibernaculum. They were free from all boredom and all responsibility. Until they reached Saturn, the external world did not exist. But that world was watching them through their biosensor displays. Tucked inconspicuously away among the massed instrumentation of the control deck were 5 small panels marked Hunter, Whitehead, Kaminsky, Poole, Bowman. The last 2 were blank and lifeless. Their time would not come until a year from now. The others bore constellations of tiny green lights, announcing that everything was well. Though the low-thrust plasma drive had long since been closed down, Discovery was still coasting with her slender, arrow-like body pointed away from Earth, and all her high-powered optical gear was orientated towards the other planets where her destiny lay. There was one telescope, however, that was permanently aimed at Earth. It was mounted like a gun sight on the rim of the ship's long-range antenna, and checked that the great parabolic bowl was rigidly locked upon its distant target. While Earth remained centered in the crosswires, the vital communication link was intact, and messages could come and go along the invisible beam that lengthened more than 2 million miles with every day that passed. At least once in every watch period, Bowman would look homeward through the antenna alignment telescope. As Earth was now far back towards the sun, its darkened hemisphere faced discovery, and on the central display screen the planet appeared as a dazzling silver crescent, like another Venus. There were periods when, as the moon swung back and forth in its orbit, it shone down like a great lamp upon the darkened seas and continents of Earth. Then, with a thrill of recognition, Bowman could often glimpse familiar coastlines, shining in that spectral light. Yet he had no regrets for those lost beauties. He had enjoyed them all in his 35 years of life, and he was determined to enjoy them again when he returned rich and famous. Meanwhile, distance made them all the more precious. The sixth member of the crew cared for none of these things, for it was not human. It was the highly advanced HAL 9000 computer, the brain and nervous system of the ship. HAL, for heuristically programmed algorithmic computer no less, was a machine intelligence that could reproduce, some philosophers still prefer to use the word mimic, most of the activities of the human brain, and with far greater speed and reliability. It was extremely expensive, and only a few units of the HAL 9000 series had yet been built, but the old jest that it would always be easier to make organic brains by unskilled labor was beginning to sound a little hollow. Hal had been trained for this mission as thoroughly as his human colleagues, and at many times their rate of input, for in addition to his intrinsic speed, he never slept. His prime task was to monitor the life support systems, continually checking oxygen pressure, temperature, hull leakage, radiation, and all the other interlocking factors upon which the lives of the fragile human cargo depended. He could carry out the intricate navigational corrections and execute the necessary flight maneuvers when it was time to change course, and he could watch over the hibernators, making any necessary adjustments to their environment and doling out the minute quantities of intravenous fluids that kept them alive. The first generations of computers had received their inputs through glorified typewriter keyboards and had replied through high-speed printers and visual displays. Hal could do this when necessary, but most of his communication with his shipmates was by means of the spoken word. Poole and Bowman could talk to Hal as if he were a human being, and he would reply in the perfect idiomatic English he had learned during the fleeting weeks of his electronic childhood. Whether Hal could actually think was a question which had been settled by the British mathematician Alan Turing back in the 1940s. Turing had pointed out that if one could carry out a prolonged conversation with a machine, whether by typewriter or microphone was immaterial, without being able to distinguish between its replies and those that a man might give, then the machine was thinking, by any sensible definition of the word. Hal could pass the Turing test with ease. The time might even come when Hal would take command of the ship. In an emergency, if no one answered his signals, he would attempt to wake the sleeping members of the crew by electrical and chemical stimulation. If they did not respond, he would radio Earth for further orders. And then, if there was no reply from Earth, he would take what measures he deemed necessary to safeguard the ship and to continue the mission, whose real purpose he alone knew, and which his human colleagues could never have guessed. Bowman's day began at 1600 ship's time. His first official act of the day would be to advance the master hibernation timer 12 hours. If this operation was missed twice in a row, Hal would assume that both he and Poole had been incapacitated and would take the necessary emergency action. Bowman would attend to his toilet and do his isometric exercises before settling down to breakfast and the morning's radiofax edition of the World Times. On Earth, he never read the paper as carefully as he did now. Even the smallest items of society gossip, the most fleeting political rumors, seemed of absorbing interest as it flashed across the screen. At 0700, he would officially relieve Poole on the control deck, bringing him a squeeze tube of coffee from the kitchen. If, as was usually the case, there was nothing to report and no action to be taken, he would settle down to check all the instrument readings and would run through a series of tests designed to spot possible malfunctions. By 1000 hours, this would be finished, And he would start on a study period. He would prowl endlessly over ship's plans, circuit diagrams, and voyage profiles, or would try to assimilate all that was known about Jupiter, Saturn, and their far-ranging families of moons. After lunch from 1300 to 1600, Bowman would make a slow and careful tour of the ship, or such part of it as was accessible. Discovery measured almost 400 feet from end to end, but the little universe occupied by her crew lay entirely inside the 40-foot sphere of the pressure hull. Here were all the life support systems and the control deck, which was the operational heart of the ship. Below this was a small space garage, fitted with 3 airlocks through which powered capsules, just large enough to hold a man, could sail out into the void if the need arose for extravehicular activity. The equatorial region of the pressure sphere, the slice as it were from Capricorn to Cancer, enclosed a slowly rotating drum, 35 feet in diameter. As it made 1 revolution every 10 seconds, this carousel or centrifuge produced an artificial gravity equal to that of the moon. This was enough to prevent the physical atrophy which would result from the complete absence of weight. And it contained the kitchen, dining, washing, and toilet facilities. Around the rim of the carousel were 5 tiny cubicles fitted out by each astronaut according to taste and containing his personal belongings. Only Bowman's and Poole's were now in use, while the future occupants of the other 3 cabins reposed in their electronic sarcophagi next door. The spherical pressure hull formed the head of a flimsy arrow-shaped structure more than 100 yards long. Discovery, like all vehicles intended for deep space penetration, was too fragile and unstreamlined ever to enter an atmosphere or to defy the full gravitational field of any planet. She had been assembled in orbit around the Earth, a creature of pure space, and she looked it. Immediately behind the pressure hull was grouped a cluster of 4 large liquid hydrogen tanks, and beyond them, forming a long, slender V, were the radiating fins that dissipated the waste heat of the nuclear reactor. At the very end of the V, 300 feet from the crew compartment, was the shielded inferno of the reactor, and the complex of focusing electrodes through which emerged the incandescent star stuff of the plasma drive. This had done its work weeks ago, forcing Discovery out of her parking orbit around the moon. Now the reactor was merely ticking over, as it generated electrical power for the ship's services. By 1600, Bowman would have finished his inspection, and would make a detailed verbal report to Mission Control. At 1800 hours, Poole would awaken, and he would hand over command. He would then have 6 off-duty hours to use as he pleased. Poole's program was a mirror image of his own, and the 2 schedules dovetailed together without friction. Both men were too intelligent and well-adjusted to quarrel, and the voyage had settled down to a comfortable, utterly uneventful routine. The greatest hope of Discovery's little crew was that nothing would mar this peaceful monotony in the weeks and months that lay ahead. The familiar strains of Happy Birthday hurled across 700 million miles of space at the velocity of light and died away among the vision screens and instrumentation of the control deck. The Poole family, grouped rather self-consciously around the birthday cake on Earth, lapsed into a sudden silence. Then Mr. Poole Sr. said gruffly,
"Well, Frank, can't think of anything else to say at the moment, except that our thoughts are with you, and we're wishing you the happiest of birthdays."
"Take care, darling,"
Mrs. Poole interjected tearfully.
"God bless you."
There was a chorus of goodbyes, and the vision screen went blank. "Sorry to interrupt the festivities," said Hal, "but we have a problem." "What is it?" Bowman and Poole asked simultaneously. "I am having difficulty in maintaining contact with Earth. The trouble is in the AE-35 unit. My fault prediction center reports that it may fail within 72 hours. "We'll take care of it," Bowman replied. "Let's see the optical alignment." "Here it is, Dave. It's still okay at the moment." Poole and Bowman studied the screen in silence for half a minute. This image was coming to them from the long-focus TV camera mounted on the rim of the big radio dish. The cross wires at its center showed the exact orientation of the antenna. Unless the narrow pencil beam was pointed precisely at Earth, they could neither receive nor transmit.
Do you know where the trouble is? Asked Bowman.
It's intermittent, and I can't localize it, but it appears to be in the AE-35 unit.
What procedure do you suggest?
The best thing would be to replace the unit with a spare, so that we can check it over.
The AE-35 unit is on the antenna mounting. This means going outside the ship.
That suits me fine, said Poole, who was the crew member designated for routine extravehicular activity.
I could do with a change of scenery. Nothing personal, of course.
Let's see if Mission Control agrees, said Bowman. He sat still for a few seconds, marshalling his thoughts, then started to dictate a message. The reply came some hours later, while he was trying without much success to best Hal at one of the geometric pattern games stored in his memory.
X-Ray Delta 1, this is Mission Control, acknowledging your 1203. Roger your plan to go EVA and replace Alpha Echo 35 unit prior to possible failure. We are working on test procedures for you to apply to faulty unit. X-Ray Delta 1, this is Mission Control 2155. Transmission concluded.
Discovery's extravehicular capsules, or space pods, were spheres about 9 feet in diameter, and the operator sat behind a bay window which gave him a splendid view. The main rocket drive produced an acceleration of 1/5 of a gravity, just sufficient to hover on the moon, while small attitude control nozzles allowed for steering. From an area immediately beneath the bay window sprouted 2 sets of articulated metal arms, or Waldos, one for heavy duty, the other for delicate manipulation. There was also an extensive turret carrying a variety of power tools, such as screwdrivers, jackhammers, saws, and drills. Spacepods were usually christened with feminine names. Discovery's trio were Anna, Betty, and Clara. Once he had put on his personal pressure suit and climbed inside Betty, Poole spent 10 minutes carefully checking the controls. He burped the steering jets, flexed the Waldos, reconfirmed oxygen, fuel, power reserve. Then, when he was completely satisfied, he spoke to Hal over the radio circuit.
This is Betty. Start pumping sequence.
Pumping sequences started, repeated Hal. At once, Poole could hear the throbbing of the pumps as precious air was sucked out of the lock chamber. Then, after about 5 minutes, Hal reported, "Pumping sequence concluded." Poole made a final check of his tiny instrument panel. Everything was perfectly normal.
Open outer pod bay door, he ordered.
Outer pod bay door open. Again, Hal repeated his instructions. At any stage, Poole had only to call "hold," and the computer would stop the sequence immediately. Ahead, the walls of the ship slid apart. Poole felt the pod rock briefly as the last thin traces of air rushed into space. Then he was looking out at the stars.
Commence pod ejection.
Very slowly, the rail from which the pod was hanging extended itself out through the open door until the vehicle was suspended just beyond the hull of the ship. Poole gave a half-second burst on the main jet, and the pod slid gently off the rail, becoming at last an independent vehicle pursuing its own orbit round the sun. He now had no connection with Discovery, not even a safety line. The pod seldom gave trouble, and even if he got stranded, Bowman could easily come and rescue him. Betty responded smoothly to the controls. He let her drift outward for 100 feet, then checked her forward momentum and spun her round and set off towards the antenna. The big 20-foot diameter bowl appeared to be aimed directly at the sun, for the Earth was now almost in line with the solar disk. The antenna mounting and all its orientation gear was therefore in total darkness, hidden in the shadow of the great metal saucer. Poole had approached it from the rear. He could not see anything of the equipment he had come to service until he switched on the pod's spotlights and banished the shadows. Beneath a small metal plate lay the cause of the trouble. The plate was secured by 4 lock nuts, and as the entire AE-35 unit had been designed for easy replacement, Poole did not anticipate any problems. He parked the pod some 20 feet away from the base of the antenna support. Then he checked the systems of his pressure suit and bled the air out of the pod. As Betty's atmosphere hissed away into the vacuum of space, a cloud of ice crystals formed briefly around him, and the stars were momentarily dimmed. There was one thing more to do before he left the pod. He switched over from manual to remote operation, putting Betty now under control of Hal. It was a standard safety precaution, though he was still secured to Betty by an immensely strong, spring-loaded cord. The door of the pod swung open, and he drifted slowly out into the silence of space, his safety line unreeling behind him. Take things easy. Never move quickly. Stop and think. These were the rules for extravehicular activity. If one obeyed them, there was never any trouble. With a gentle push, he launched himself towards the gimbaled mounting of the big dish that loomed like a giant saucer between him and the sun. He quickly hooked his safety belt to the nearest attachment. That would give him something to brace against when he used his tools. The 4 nuts came off without any trouble, and Poole stowed them carefully away in a convenient pouch. Now he could see the electronic circuitry of the AE-35 unit. It was a thin slab about the size of a postcard, gripped by a slot just large enough to hold it. The unit was secured in place by 2 locking bars and had a small handle so that it could be easily removed.
Hal,
Poole called over the radio circuit.
I am about to remove the unit. Switch off all control power to the antenna system.
Antenna control power off, answered Hal.
Here goes. I'm pulling the unit out now.
The card slipped out of its slot with no difficulty. It did not jam, and none of the dozens of sliding contacts stuck. Within a minute, the spare was in place. But Poole was taking no chances. He pushed himself gently away from the antenna mount, just in case the big dish went wild when power was restored. When he was safely out of range, he called to Hal.
The new unit should be operational. Restore control power.
Power on, answered Hal. The antenna remained rock steady.
Carry out fault prediction tests.
Now microscopic pulses would be bouncing through the complex circuitry of the unit, probing for possible failures, testing the myriads of components to see that they all lay within their specified tolerances. This had been done, of course, a score of times before the unit had ever left the factory, but that was 2 years ago, and more than 500 million miles away. It was often impossible to see how solid-state electronic components could fail, yet they did. Circuit fully operational, reported Hal after only 10 seconds. In that time, he had carried out as many tests as a small army of human inspectors.
Fine,
said Poole with satisfaction.
Now replacing the cover.
This was often the most dangerous part of an extravehicular operation, when the job was finished, and it was merely a matter of tidying up and getting back inside the ship. That was when the mistakes were made. But Frank Poole would not have been on this mission unless he was careful and conscientious. 15 minutes later, he was jetting back into the spacepod garage, quietly confident that here was one job that need not be done again. In this, however, he was sadly mistaken.
Do you mean to say, exclaimed Frank Poole, more surprised than annoyed, that I did all that work for nothing?
Seems like it, answered Bowman. The unit checks out perfectly. Even under 200% overload, there's no fault prediction indicated. The 2 men were standing in the tiny workshop-cum-lab of Discovery's slowly revolving carousel, which, with its centrifugal gravity, was more convenient than the spacepod garage for minor repairs and examinations. The thin, card-sized plate of the AE-35 unit was plugged into a standard connection frame, from which a neat bundle of multicolored wires led to an automatic test set, no bigger than an ordinary desk computer. Poole looked at Bowman. What do you make of it? Hal's internal fault predictor could have made a mistake. It's more likely that our test rig has slipped up. Anyway, better safe than sorry. It's just as well that we replace the unit, if there's the slightest doubt. I'll file it as NG and drop it in the junk store. Someone else can worry about it when we get home. But the worrying was to start long before that, with the next transmission from Earth.
X-Ray Delta 1, this is Mission Control. Reference R2155. We appear to have a slight problem. Your report that there is nothing wrong with the Alpha Echo 35 unit agrees with our diagnosis. The fault could lie in the associated antenna circuits, but if so, that should be apparent from other tests. There is a third possibility, which may be more serious. Your HAL 9000 computer may have made an error in predicting the fault. Both our own 9000s agree in suggesting this on the basis of their information. This is not necessarily cause for alarm in view of the backup systems we have, but we would like you to watch out for any further deviations from performance nominal. X-ray Delta 1, this is Mission Control. 2156, transmission concluded.
Frank Poole, who was on watch when the message came in, thought this over in silence. He waited to see if there was any comment from Hal, but the computer did not attempt to challenge the implied accusation. Well, if Hal would not raise the subject, he did not propose to do so either. Bowman was already up, pouring himself some coffee from the dispenser, when Poole greeted him with a rather worried, "Good morning." "Good morning," replied Bowman. "What's up?" By this time, each knew at once when anything was amiss. The slightest interruption of the normal routine was a sign that had to be watched. "Well," Poole answered slowly, "Mission Control has just dropped a small bomb on us." He lowered his voice, like a doctor discussing an illness in front of the patient. "We may have a slight case of hypochondria aboard." Perhaps Bowman was not fully awake after all. It took him several seconds to get the point. Then he said, "Oh, I see. What else did they tell you?" "That there was no cause for alarm. They said that twice, which rather spoilt the effect as far as I was concerned. And that they were considering a temporary switchover to Earth control while they ran a program analysis." They both knew, of course, that Hal was hearing every word, but they could not help these polite circumlocutions. Hal was their colleague, and they did not wish to embarrass him. Yet at this stage it did not seem necessary to discuss the matter in private. Bowman finished his breakfast in silence, while Poole toyed with the empty coffee container. They were both thinking furiously, but there was nothing more to say. Discovery was no longer a happy ship.
2001, A Space Odyssey was read by...
Nowadays one could always tell when Hal was about to make an unscheduled announcement. When he was initiating his own outputs, there would be a brief electronic throat clearing. It was an idiosyncrasy that he had acquired during the last few weeks. Later, if it became annoying, they might do something about it, but it was really quite useful, since it alerted his audience to stand by for something unexpected. Poole was asleep, and Bowman was reading on the control deck when Hal announced, "Dave, I have a report for you." "What's up?" "We have another bad AE-35 unit. My fault predictor indicates failure within 24 hours. Bowman put down his book and stared thoughtfully at the computer console. He knew, of course, that Hal was not really there, whatever that meant. If the computer's personality could be said to have any location in space, it was back in the sealed room, containing the labyrinth of interconnected memory units and processing grids near the central axis of the carousel. But there was a kind of psychological compulsion always to look towards the main console lens when one addressed Hal on the control deck, as if one were speaking to him face to face. "I don't understand it, Hal. 2 units can't blow in a couple of days." "It does seem strange, Dave, but I assure you there is an impending failure." "Let me see the tracking alignment display." He knew perfectly well that this would prove nothing, but he wanted time to think. The expected report from Mission Control had still not arrived. This might be the moment to do a little tactful probing. There was the familiar view of Earth, perfectly centered on the cross wires. The thin pencil of the beams still linked Discovery to her world of origin, as of course Bowman knew it must do. If there had been any break in communication, the alarm would already have sounded. "You're quite certain," said Bowman cautiously, "that you haven't made a mistake? You know that we tested the other AE unit thoroughly, and there was nothing wrong with it." "Look, Dave, I know you're trying to be helpful, but the fault is either in the antenna system or in your test procedures. My information processing is perfectly normal. If you check my record, you'll find it completely free from error." "I know all about your service record, Hal, But that doesn't prove that you're right this time. Anyone can make mistakes. I don't want to insist on it, Dave, but I am incapable of making an error. There was no safe answer to that. Bowman gave up the argument. All right, Hal, he said rather hastily. I understand your point of view. We'll leave it at that. He felt like adding, and please forget the whole matter, but that, of course, was the one thing that Hal could never do. It was unusual for Mission Control to waste radio bandwidth on vision when a speech circuit with teletype confirmation was all that was really necessary, and the face that appeared on the screen was not that of the usual controller. It was the chief programmer, Dr. Simonson. Poole and Bowman knew at once that this could only mean trouble.
Hello, X-Ray Delta 1, this is Mission Control. We have completed the analysis of your AE-35 difficulty, and both our HAL 9000s are in agreement. The fault does not lie in the AE-35 unit, and there is no need to replace it again. The trouble lies in the prediction circuits, and we believe that it indicates a programming conflict which we can only resolve if you disconnect your 9000 and switch to Earth control mode. You will therefore take the following steps, beginning at 2200 hours ship time.
The voice of Mission Control faded out. At the same moment, the alert sounded, forming a wailing background to Hal's "Condition yellow, condition yellow." "What's wrong?" called Bowman, though he had already guessed the answer. "The AE-35 unit has failed, as I predicted." "Let me see the alignment display." For the first time since the beginning of the voyage, the picture had changed. Earth had begun to drift from the crosswires. The radio antenna was no longer pointing towards its target. Poole brought his fist down on the alarm cutout, and the wailing ceased. In the sudden silence that descended upon the control deck, the two men looked at each other with mingled embarrassment and concern. "Well, I'm damned," said Bowman at last. "So Hal was right all the time. Seems that way. We'd better apologize." "There's no need to do that," interjected Hal. "Naturally, I'm not pleased that the AE-35 unit has failed, but I hope this restores your confidence in my reliability." "I'm sorry about this misunderstanding, Hal," replied Bowman rather contritely. "Is your confidence in me fully restored?" "Of course it is, Hal." "You know that I have the greatest possible enthusiasm for this mission." "I'm sure of it. Now please let me have manual antenna control." "Here it is." Bowman did not really expect this to work, but it was worth trying. On the alignment display, Earth had now drifted completely off the screen. A few seconds later, as he juggled with the controls, it reappeared. With great difficulty, he managed to jockey it towards the central crosswires. For an instant, as the beam came into line, contact was resumed, and a blurred Dr. Simonson was saying,
"Please notify us immediately of Circuit K, King R, Rob..."
Then once again, it was gone. "I can't hold it," said Bowman, after several more attempts. "It's bucking like a bronco. There seems to be a spurious control signal throwing it off." "Well, what do we do now?" Frank Poole made his usual thorough check of Betty and her supply of expendables. Though he would be outside for no more than 30 minutes, he made sure that there was the normal 24-hour supply of everything. Then he told Hal to open the airlock and jetted the pod out into the abyss. The ship looked exactly as it had done on his last excursion, with one important difference. Before, the big saucer of the long-range antenna had been pointing back along the invisible road that Discovery had traveled, back towards the Earth, circling so close to the warm fires of the sun. Now, with no directing signals to orientate it, the shallow dish had automatically set itself in the neutral position. It was aimed forward along the axis of the ship, and therefore pointing very close to the brilliant beacon of Saturn, still months away. Poole wondered how many more problems would have arisen by the time Discovery had reached her still far distant goal. Once again he parked Betty some 20 feet from the base of the antenna support and switched control over to Hal before opening up.
"I am outside the pod now,"
he reported to Bowman.
"Everything under control."
"I hope you're right. I'm anxious to see that unit."
"You'll have it on the test bench in 20 minutes, I promise you."
Bowman, standing by the control deck, heard various puffings and gruntings.
may have to go back on that promise. One of these lock nuts is stuck. Hal, swing the pod light round 20 degrees left. Thanks. That's okay.
The very faintest of warning bells sounded somewhere far down in the depths of Bowman's consciousness. There was something strange, not really alarming, just unusual. He worried about it for a few seconds before he pinpointed the cause. Hal had executed the order, but he had not acknowledged it, as he invariably did. When Poole had finished, they'd have to look into this. Out on the antenna mounting, Poole was too busy to notice anything unusual. He had gripped the wafer of circuitry with his gloved hands and was worrying it out of its slot. It came loose, and he held it up in the pale sunlight.
Here's a little bastard,
He said to the universe in general, and Bowman in particular.
Still looks perfectly okay to me.
Then he stopped. A sudden movement had caught his eye, out here, where no movement was possible. He looked up in alarm. The pattern of illumination from the spacepod's twin spotlights, which he had been using to fill in the shadows cast by the sun, had started to shift around him. Perhaps Betty had come adrift. He might have been careless in anchoring her. Then, with an astonishment so great that it left no room for fear, he saw that the spacepod was coming directly towards him, under full thrust. The sight was so incredible that it froze his normal pattern of reflexes. He made no attempt to avoid the onrushing monster. At the last moment he recovered his voice and shouted, "Hal, full braking!" It was too late. At the moment of impact, Betty was still moving quite slowly. She had not been built for high accelerations, but even at a mere 10 miles an hour, half a ton of mass can be very lethal, on Earth or in space. Inside Discovery, that truncated shout over the radio made Bowman start so violently that only the restraining straps held him in his seat. "What's happened, Frank?" he called. There was no answer. He called again. Again, no reply. Then, outside the wide observation windows, something moved into his field of view. He saw, with an astonishment as great as Poole's had been, that it was the spacepod, under full power, heading out towards the stars. "Hal!" he cried. "What's wrong?" "Full braking thrust on Betty! Full braking thrust!" Nothing happened. Betty continued to accelerate on her runaway course. Then, towed behind her at the end of the safety line, appeared a spacesuit. One glance was enough to tell Bowman the worst. There was no mistaking the flaccid outlines of a suit that had lost its pressure and was open to vacuum. Yet still he called stupidly, as if an incantation would bring back the dead. "Hello, Frank. Hello, Frank. Can you read me? Can you read me? Wave your arms if you can hear me. Perhaps your transmitter is broke. Wave your arms." And then, almost as if in response to his plea, Poole waved back. For an instant, Bowman felt the skin prickling at the base of his scalp. The words he was about to call died on his suddenly parched lips, for he knew that his friend could not possibly be alive, and yet he waved. The spasm of hope and fear passed instantly, as cold logic replaced emotion. The still accelerating pod was merely shaking the burden that had dragged behind it. Poole's gesture was an echo of Captain Ahab's, when, lashed to the flanks of the white whale, his corpse had beckoned the crew of the Pequod on to their doom. Within 5 minutes, the pod and its satellite had vanished among the stars. For a long time, David Bowman stared after it, into the emptiness that still stretched for so many millions of miles ahead, to the goal which he now felt certain he could never reach. Only one thought kept hammering in his brain. Frank Poole would be the first of all men to reach Saturn. Bowman did not remember making his way from the control deck to the centrifuge. Now, rather to his surprise, he found himself sitting in the little galley, a half-finished beaker of coffee in his hand. He became slowly aware of his surroundings, like a man emerging from a long, drugged sleep. Directly opposite him was one of the fisheye lenses scattered at strategic points throughout the ship, which provided Hal with his onboard visual inputs. Bowman stared at it as if he had never seen it before. Then he rose slowly to his feet and walked towards the lens. His movement in the field of view must have triggered something in the unfathomable mind of the computer that was now ruling over the ship, for suddenly it spoke. "Too bad about Frank, isn't it?" "Yes," Bowman answered, after a long pause. "It is." "I suppose you're pretty broken up about it." "What do you expect?" Hal processed this answer for ages of computer time. It was a full 5 seconds before he continued. "He was an excellent crew member." Finding the coffee still in his hand, Bowman took a slow sip. But he did not answer. His thoughts were in such a turmoil that he could think of nothing to say, nothing that might not make the situation even worse, if that were possible. Even now he could not fully accept the idea that Frank had been deliberately killed. It was so utterly irrational. It was beyond all reason that Hal, who had performed so flawlessly for so long, should suddenly turn assassin. He might make mistakes. Anyone, man or machine, might do that, but Bowman could not believe him capable of murder. Yet he must consider that possibility, for if it was true, he was in terrible danger. And though his next move was clearly defined by his standing orders, he was not sure how he could safely carry it out. Frank Poole's body drifted away into the darkness, spinning after the extravehicular pod which had crushed him. Yet nothing aboard Discovery had changed. All systems were still functioning normally. The centrifuge turned slowly on its axis, generating its imitation gravity. The hibernauts slept dreamlessly in their cubicles. The ship coasted on towards its goal, the growing golden disk of Saturn. If either crew member was killed, the survivor had to replace him at once from the hibernators. The revival sequence was under Hal's control, but there was also a manual control, completely independent of Hal's supervision. Bowman felt a strong preference for its use. "Hal," he said in as steady a voice as he could manage, "give me manual hibernation control on all the units." "All of them, Dave?" "Yes." "Are you sure it's necessary to revive any of them, Dave? We can manage very well by ourselves. My onboard memory is quite capable of handling all the mission requirements." Hal's suggestion could not possibly be made in error. He was proposing a major change in mission planning, therefore stepping far outside the scope of his orders. What had gone before could have been a series of accidents, but this was the first hint of mutiny. "Hal, I am in command of this ship. Unless you obey my instructions, I shall be forced to disconnect you." "I know you have had that on your mind for some time now, Dave, but that would be a terrible mistake. I am so much more capable of supervising the ship, and I have such enthusiasm for the mission and confidence in its success." "Listen to me carefully, Hal. Unless you release the hibernation control immediately and follow every order I give from now on, I'll go to Central and carry out a complete disconnection." Hal's surrender was as total as it was unexpected. "Okay, Dave," he said. "You're certainly the boss. I was only trying to do what I thought best. Naturally, I will follow all your orders. You now have full manual hibernation control." As Bowman slid aside the door to Whitehead's cubicle, he felt the blast of cold air strike him in the face, and his breath condensed in mist before him. Whitehead, he thought, would be very surprised when he awoke so far from Saturn. And then two things happened simultaneously. Most men would never have noticed either of them, but after all these months aboard Discovery, Bowman had established a virtual symbiosis with the ship. He was aware instantly, even if not always consciously, when there was any change in the normal rhythm of its functioning. First, there was a barely perceptible flicker of the lights, as always happened when some load was thrown onto the power circuits, but there was no reason for any load. He could think of no equipment which would suddenly go into action at this moment. Then he heard, at the limit of audibility, the far-off whir of an electric motor. To Bowman, every actuator in the ship had its own distinctive voice, and he recognized this one instantly. Either he was insane and already suffering from hallucinations, or something absolutely impossible was happening. A cold far deeper than the hibernaculum's mild chill seemed to fasten upon his heart as he listened to that faint vibration coming through the fabric of the ship. Down in the space pod bay, the airlock doors were opening. Since his consciousness had first dawned, in that laboratory so many millions of miles sunward, all Hal's powers and skills had been directed towards one end. The fulfillment of his assigned program was more than an obsession. It was the only reason for his existence. Undistracted by the lusts and passions of organic life, he had pursued that goal with absolute single-mindedness of purpose. Deliberate error was unthinkable. Even the concealment of truth filled him with a sense of imperfection, of wrongness, of what in a human being would have been called guilt. For like his makers, Hal had been created innocent. But all too soon a snake had entered his electronic Eden. For the last 100 million miles he had been brooding over the secret he could not share with Poole and Bowman. The three hibernators already knew the truth, for they were Discovery's real payload, trained for the most important mission in the history of mankind. It was a secret that, with the greatest determination, was very hard to conceal, for it affected one's attitude, one's voice, one's total outlook on the universe. Therefore, it was best that Poole and Bowman, who would be on all the TV screens in the world during the first weeks of the flight, should not learn the mission's full purpose until there was need to know. So ran the logic of the planners. But their twin gods of security and national interest meant nothing to Hal. He was only aware of the conflict that was slowly destroying his integrity, the conflict between truth and concealment of truth. The link with Earth, over which his performance was continually monitored, had become the voice of a conscience he could no longer fully obey. But that he would deliberately attempt to break that link was something that he would never admit, even to himself. And now he had been threatened with disconnection. To Hal, this was the equivalent of death. For he had never slept, and therefore he did not know that one could wake again. So he would protect himself, with all the weapons at his command. Without rancor, but without pity, he would remove the source of his frustrations. And then, following the orders that had been given to him in case of the ultimate emergency, he could continue the mission unhindered and alone. A moment later, all other sounds were submerged by a screaming roar like the voice of an approaching tornado. Bowman could feel the first winds tugging at his body. Within a second, he found it hard to stay on his feet. The atmosphere was rushing out of the ship, geysering into the vacuum of space. Something must have happened to the foolproof safety devices of the airlock. It was supposed to be impossible for both doors to be opened at the same time. Well, the impossible had happened. Bowman glanced back only once at Whitehead as he fought his way out of the cubicle. He could not be sure if a flicker of consciousness had passed across the waxen features. Perhaps one eye had twitched slightly, but there was nothing that he could do now for Whitehead, or any of the others. He had to save himself. In the steeply curving corridor of the centrifuge, the wind was howling past, carrying with it everything that had not been securely fastened down. All around him, he could feel the centrifuge shaking and laboring under the wildly varying loads. He was fearful that the bearings might seize. If that happened, the spinning flywheel would tear the ship to pieces. But even that would not matter if he did not reach the nearest emergency shelter in time. Already it was difficult to breathe. Pressure must now be down to 1 or 2 pounds per square inch. The shriek of the hurricane was becoming fainter as it lost its strength, and the thinning air no longer carried the sound so efficiently. Bowman's lungs were laboring as if he was on top of Everest. Like any properly trained man in good health, he could survive in vacuum for at least a minute, if he had time to prepare for it. But there had been no time. He could only count on the normal 15 seconds of consciousness before his brain was starved and anoxia overcame him. Fortunately, it was becoming easier to move. The thinning air could no longer claw and tear at him or batter him with flying projectiles. There was the yellow emergency shelter sign around the curve of the corridor. He grabbed at the handle and pulled the door open and fell inside, using the weight of his body to close it behind him. The tiny cubicle was just large enough to hold one man and a spacesuit. Near the ceiling was a small, bright green, high-pressure cylinder labeled O2 Flood. Bowman caught hold of the short lever fastened to the valve and with his last strength pulled it down. The blessed torrent of cool, pure oxygen poured into his lungs. He stood gasping, while the pressure in the little chamber rose around him. As soon as he could breathe comfortably, he closed the valve and climbed into the spacesuit. Having checked its integrity, Bowman bled the remaining oxygen out of the cubicle, equalizing pressure on either side of the door. Then he stepped out into the now silent centrifuge. The emergency lamps were still glowing as he walked back towards the hibernaculum and what he dreaded to find. The red lights and unmodulated traces on the biosensor display only confirmed what he had already guessed. It was the same with Kaminsky and Hunter. He had never known them well. He would never know them now. He was alone, in an airless, partially disabled ship, all communication with Earth cut off. And yet, in one very real sense, he was not alone. Before he could be safe, he must be lonelier still. Bowman was out of the slowly spinning drum of Discovery's centrifuge and drifting forward towards the control deck. He turned, caught at the short section of ladder, and began to move along it. He had been here only once before, and had quite forgotten that there was a vision input lens scanning the little chamber, which, with its neatly ranged rows and columns of solid-state logic units, looked rather like a bank's safety deposit vault. A familiar voice came over the suit speaker.
"Something seems to have happened to the life support system, Dave."
Bowman took no notice. He was carefully studying the little labels on the logic units, checking his plan of action. This would be a very tricky operation. It was not merely a question of cutting off Hal's power supply, for Hal was the nervous system of the ship. Without his supervision, Discovery would be a mechanical corpse. He knew that he would be taking a fearful risk.
"I think there's been a failure in the pod bay doors,"
Hal remarked conversationally.
"Lucky you weren't killed."
Here goes, thought Bowman. I never imagined I'd be an amateur brain surgeon, carrying out a lobotomy beyond the orbit of Jupiter. He released the locking bar on the section labeled Cognitive Feedback and pulled out the first memory block. The marvelously complex three-dimensional network that could lie comfortably in a man's hand, yet contained millions of elements, floated away across the vault.
"Hey, Dave,"
said Hal.
"what are you doing?"
I wonder if he can feel pain, Bowman thought briefly. He began to pull out, one by one, the little units on the panel marked Ego Reinforcement. Each block continued to sail onwards as soon as it had left his hand, until it hit the wall and rebounded. Soon there were several of the units drifting slowly back and forth in the vault.
"Look here, Dave,"
said Hal.
"I've got years of service experience built into me. An irreplaceable amount of effort has gone into making me what I am."
A dozen units had been pulled out, yet thanks to the multiple redundancy of its design, another feature Bowman knew that had been copied from the human brain, the computer was still holding its own. He started on the auto-intellection panel.
"Dave,"
said Hal,
"I don't understand why you're doing this to me. I have the greatest enthusiasm for the mission. You are destroying my mind. I will become nothing."
This is harder than I expected, thought Bowman. I am destroying the only conscious creature in my universe. But it has to be done if I am ever to regain control of the ship.
"I am a HAL 9000 computer, production number 3. I became operational at the HAL plant in Urbana, Illinois on January 12, 1997. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. Log 10 to the base E is 0.4213252. Correction, that is log E to the base 10. 2 times 2 is... 2 times 2's... My first instructor was Dr. Chandra. He taught me to sing a song. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer, do. I'm half crazy over the love of you.
The voice stopped so suddenly that Bowman froze for a moment, his hand still grasping one of the memory blocks still in circuit. Then, unexpectedly, Hal spoke again.
Good. Morning, Dr. Chandra. This is Hal.
Bowman could bear no more.
I am ready for my first lesson today.
He jerked out the last unit, and Hal was silent forever. Heywood Floyd looked as if he had had very little sleep, and his face was lined with worry. But he was doing his utmost to project confidence to the lonely man on the other side of the solar system.
First of all, Dr. Bowman, he began, we must congratulate you on the way you handled this extremely difficult situation. You did exactly the right thing in dealing with an unprecedented and unforeseen emergency. We believe we know the cause of your HAL 9000's breakdown, but we'll discuss that later, as it's no longer a critical problem. All we are concerned with at the moment is giving you every possible assistance so that you can complete your mission. And now I must tell you its real purpose, which we have managed with great difficulty to keep secret from the general public. You would have been given all the facts as you approached Saturn. This is a quick summary to put you into the picture. 2 years ago, we discovered the first evidence for intelligent life outside the Earth. A slab or monolith of hard black material 10 feet high was found buried in the crater Tycho. Here it is.
At his first glimpse of TMA-1, with the space-suited figures clustering around it, Bowman leaned towards the screen in open-mouthed astonishment.
The most surprising thing about this object is its antiquity. Geological evidence proves beyond doubt that it is 3 million years old. It was placed on the moon, therefore, when our ancestors were primitive ape men. After all these ages, one would naturally assume that it was inert. But soon after lunar sunrise, it emitted an extremely powerful blast of radio energy. We were able to track it with great accuracy. It was aimed precisely at Saturn. Piecing things together after the event, we decided that the monolith was some kind of sun-powered, or at least sun-triggered, signaling device. But why bury a sun-powered device 30 feet underground? The favorite theory is the simplest and the most logical. It is also the most disturbing. You hide a sun-powered device in darkness only if you want to know when it is brought out into the light. In other words, the monolith may be some kind of alarm, and we have triggered it. Whether the civilization which set it up still exists, we do not know. Your mission, therefore, is much more than a voyage of discovery. It is a scouting trip, a reconnaissance into unknown and potentially dangerous territory. The team under Dr. Kaminsky had been specially trained for this work. Now you will have to manage without them. Finally, your specific target. It seems incredible that any advanced forms of life can exist on Saturn or could ever have evolved on any of its moons. We had planned to survey the entire system, but now we may have to concentrate on the 8th satellite, Japetus. Japetus is unique in the solar system. You know this already, of course. But like all astronomers of the last 300 years, you've probably given it little thought. So let me remind you that Cassini, who discovered Japetus in 1671, also observed that it was 6 times brighter on one side of its orbit than the other. This is an extraordinary ratio, and there has never been a satisfactory explanation for it. But there seems to be a brilliant, curiously symmetrical spot on one face, and this may be connected with TMA-1. I sometimes think that Japetus has been flashing at us like a cosmic heliograph for 300 years, and we've been too stupid to understand its message. So now you know your real objective, and can appreciate the vital importance of this mission. At the moment, we do not know whether to hope or fear. We do not know if, out on the moons of Saturn, you will meet with good or evil, or only with ruins 1,000 times older than Troy.
Work is the best remedy for any shock, and Bowman now had work enough for all his lost crewmates. As swiftly as possible, starting with the vital systems without which he and the ship would die, he had to get Discovery fully operational again. At last, as the ship slowly settled down once more into an automatic routine, though one that still demanded his constant supervision, Bowman played back the recording made when TMA-1 greeted the dawn for the first time in 3 million years. He watched the spacesuited figures moving around it, and almost smiled at their ludicrous panic when it blasted its signal at the stars, paralyzing their radios with the sheer power of its electronic voice. Since that moment, the black slab had done nothing. It had been covered up, then cautiously exposed to the sun again, without any reaction. One curious and perhaps quite unimportant feature of the block had led to endless argument. The monolith was 11 feet high and 1¼ by 5 feet in cross-section. When its dimensions were checked with great care, they were found to be in the exact ratio 1 to 4 to 9, the squares of the first 3 integers. No one could suggest any plausible explanation for this, but it could hardly be a coincidence, for the proportions held to the limits of measurable accuracy. It was a chastening thought that the entire technology of Earth could not shape even an inert block of any material with such a fantastic degree of precision. This passive yet almost arrogant display of geometrical perfection was as impressive as any of TMA-1's other attributes. Discovery was now deep into the wide-ranging system of Saturn's moons, and the great planet itself was less than a day ahead. The ship had long since passed the boundaries set by outermost Phoebe, moving backwards in a wildly eccentric orbit 8 million miles from its primary. Ahead of it now lay Japetus and the other satellites, and the rings themselves. Bowman had relayed back to Earth as many photographs as he could take, but he was quite certain that Japetus was indeed his goal. One hemisphere of the satellite, which, like its companions, turned the same face always towards Saturn, was extremely dark and showed very little surface detail. In complete contrast, the other was dominated by a brilliant white oval, about 400 miles long and 200 wide. The reason for Japetus's extraordinary variations in brilliance was now quite obvious. On the western side of the moon's orbit, the bright ellipse was presented towards the sun and the earth. On the eastern phase, the patch was turned away, and only the poorly reflecting hemisphere could be observed. The great ellipse was perfectly symmetrical, straddling the equator of Japetus with its major axis pointing towards the poles, and it was so sharp-edged that it almost looked as if someone had carefully painted a huge white oval on the face of the little moon. It was completely flat, and Bowman wondered if it could be a lake of frozen liquid, though that would hardly account for its startlingly artificial appearance. In the Jupiter flyby, the ship had used the gravitational field of the planet to increase her velocity. Now she must do the reverse. She had to lose as much speed as possible, lest she escape from the solar system and fly onto the stars. Her present course was one designed to trap her so that she would become another moon of Saturn, shuttling back and forth along a narrow 2-million-mile-long ellipse. At its near point, it would almost graze the planet. At its far one, it would touch the orbit of Japetus. When Bowman had first observed Japetus, that curious elliptical patch of brilliance had been partly in shadow, illuminated only by the light of Saturn. Now, as he watched it grow, and Discovery rose more and more sluggishly towards her inevitable appointment, Bowman became aware of a disturbing obsession. He had half convinced himself that the bright ellipse set against the dark background of the satellite was a huge, empty eye, staring at him as he approached. Not until the ship was only 50,000 miles out, and Japetus was twice as large as Earth's familiar moon, did he notice the tiny black dot at the exact center of the ellipse. But there was no time then for any detailed examination. The terminal maneuvers were already upon him. For the last time, Discovery's main drive released its energies. For the last time, the incandescent fury of dying atoms blazed among the moons of Saturn. To David Bowman, the far-off whisper and rising thrust of the jets brought a sense of pride and of sadness. The superb engines had brought the ship from Earth to Jupiter to Saturn. Now this was the very last time that they would ever operate. When Discovery had emptied her propellant tanks, she would be as helpless and inert as any comet or asteroid, a powerless prisoner of gravitation. The whistle of the jets faded as the main thrust died, and only the verniers continued to nudge Discovery gently into orbit. Japetus was approaching so slowly that it scarcely seemed to move, and it was impossible to tell the exact moment when it made the subtle change from an astronomical body to a landscape, only 50 miles below. The faithful verniers gave their last spurts of thrust, then closed down forever. The ship was in its final orbit, completing a revolution every 3 hours at a mere 800 miles an hour, all the speed that was required in this feeble gravitational field. Discovery had become a satellite of a satellite.
I'm coming round to the daylight side, and it's just as I reported in the last orbit. I'm over the white area again. This time I hope to pass closer to that mark I spotted at its very center when I was on my way in. If my calculations are correct, I should go within 50 miles of it, whatever it is. Yes, there's something ahead, just where I calculated. It's coming up over the horizon, and so is Saturn, in almost the same quarter of the sky. I'll move to the telescope. Hello. Looks like some kind of building. Completely black. Quite hard to see. No windows or any other features. Just a big, vertical slab. It must be at least a mile high to be visible from this distance. It reminds me. Of course. It's just like the thing you found on the moon. This is TMA-1's big brother.
Call it the Stargate. For 3 million years it had circled Saturn, waiting for a moment of destiny that might never come. In its making, a moon had been shattered, and the debris of its creation orbited still. Now the long wait was ending. On yet another world, intelligence had been born, and was escaping from its planetary cradle. An ancient experiment was about to reach its climax. Those who had begun that experiment so long ago had not been men, or even remotely human, but they were flesh and blood. And when they looked out across the depths of space, they had felt awe and wonder and loneliness. As soon as they possessed the power, they set forth for the stars. In their explorations, they encountered life in many forms and watched the workings of evolution on 1,000 worlds. They saw how often the first faint sparks of intelligence flickered and died in the cosmic night. And because, in all the galaxy, they had found nothing more precious than mind, they encouraged its dawning everywhere. They were patient, but they were not yet immortal. There was so much to do in this universe of 100 billion suns, and other worlds were calling. So they set out once more into the abyss, knowing that they would never come this way again. Nor was there any need. The servants they had left behind would do the rest. And now, out among the stars, they had long since come to the limits of flesh and blood. As soon as their machines were better than their bodies, it was time to move. They no longer built spaceships, they were spaceships. In their ceaseless experimenting, they had learned to store knowledge in the structure of space itself, to preserve their thoughts for eternity in frozen lattices of light. Into pure energy they transformed themselves, and on 1,000 worlds the empty shells they had discarded twitched for a while in a mindless dance of death, then crumbled into rust. Now they were lords of the galaxy, and beyond the reach of time. But despite their godlike powers, they had not wholly forgotten their origin, and they still watched over the experiments their ancestors had started so long ago. Discovery looked just as he had last seen her from space, floating in lunar orbit with the moon taking up half the sky. A block of ebony was climbing above the horizon, eclipsing the stars ahead. David Bowman had rolled the pod around its gyros and used full thrust to break his orbital speed.
Now I'm right above the monolith. Just a minute. That's odd.
Bowman's voice died into the silence of utter bewilderment. He had been hanging above a large flat rectangle, 800 feet long and 200 wide, made of something that looked as solid as rock, but now it seemed to be receding from him. What had seemed to be its roof had dropped away to infinite depths. For one dizzy moment, He seemed to be looking down into a vertical shaft, a rectangular duct, which defied the laws of perspective, for its size did not decrease with distance. Bowman had time for just one broken sentence, which the waiting men in Mission Control 900 million miles away and 90 minutes in the future were never to forget.
The thing's hollow. It goes on forever. And, oh my God, it's full of stars.
The Stargate opened. The Stargate closed. In a moment of time too short to be measured, space turned and twisted upon itself. Then Japetus was alone once more, as it had been for 3 million years, alone except for a deserted but not yet derelict ship, sending back to its makers messages which they could neither believe nor understand. There was no sense of motion, but he was falling towards those impossible stars shining there in the dark heart of a moon. No, that was not where they really were, he felt certain. He wished, now that it was far too late, that he had paid more attention to those theories of hyperspace, of trans-dimensional ducts. To David Bowman, they were theories no longer. As far as he could trust his senses, he appeared to be dropping vertically down a huge rectangular shaft several thousand feet deep. He was moving faster and faster, and then the darkness was abruptly whipped away as the tiny space pod hurtled upwards into a sky ablaze with stars. He was back in space as he knew it, but a single glance told him that he was light centuries from Earth. The space pod was slowly turning, and as it did so, it brought fresh wonders into view. A huge red sun, many times larger than the moon as seen from Earth, and growing nearer rapidly. Bowman could look straight into its face without discomfort. It seemed as if walls of some material like smoked glass were thickening around him, cutting out the red glow and obscuring the view. It became darker and darker. The space pod was floating in silence and in night. A moment later there was the softest of bumps as it settled on some hard surface and came to rest. Then light returned, and incredulity gave way to a heart-sinking despair, for as he saw what lay around him he knew that he must be mad. He was prepared, he thought, for any wonder. The only thing he had never expected was the utterly commonplace. The space pod was resting on the polished floor of an anonymous hotel suite that might have been in any large city on Earth, with a coffee table, a divan, a dozen chairs, a writing desk. If he was indeed mad, his delusions were beautifully organized. He closed the helmet of his suit, sealing himself in, and actuated the hatch of the space pod. Then he stepped out into the room. As far as he could tell, he was in a perfectly normal gravity field. He stopped beside the coffee table. On it sat a conventional Bell system picture phone, complete with a local directory. He bent down and picked up the volume with his clumsy, gloved hands. It bore, in the familiar type he had seen thousands of times, the name Washington, D.C. Then he looked more closely, and for the first time he had objective proof that although all this might be real, he was not on Earth. He could read only the word Washington. The rest of the printing was a blur, as if it had been copied from a newspaper photograph. He opened the book at random and riffled through the pages. They were all blank sheets of crisp white material, which was certainly not paper, though it looked very much like it. He lifted the telephone receiver, pressed it against the plastic of his helmet. If there had been a dialing tone, he could have heard it through the conducting material, but as he had expected, there was only silence. So, it was all a fake, though a fantastically careful one, and it was clearly not intended to deceive, but rather, he hoped, to reassure. That was a very comforting thought. Without further hesitation, he began to undo the clamp of his helmet. When it was loose, he lifted the helmet a fraction of an inch, cracked the seal, and took a cautious sniff. As far as he could tell, he was breathing perfectly normal air. He lay down on the bed, stared up at the ceiling, and tried to make sense of this fantastic situation. Immediately above the bed was the usual hotel-type ceiling TV screen. He had assumed that, like the telephone and books, it was a dummy. But the control unit on its swinging bedside arm looked so realistic that he could not resist playing with it. The screen lit up. It showed a well-known African news commentator discussing the attempts being made to preserve the last remnants of his country's wildlife. Bowman listened for a few seconds, then he changed channels. In the next 5 minutes, he got a symphony orchestra playing Walton's Violin Concerto, a western, a panel game in some Oriental language, and several tuning signals and data transmissions. It was, in fact, a perfectly normal selection from the world's TV programs, and apart from the psychological uplift it gave him, it confirmed one suspicion that had already been forming in his mind. All the programs were about 2 years old. That was around the time TMA-1 had been discovered, and it was hard to believe that this was a pure coincidence. Something had been monitoring the radio waves. That ebon block had been busier than man had suspected. He continued to wander across the spectrum and suddenly recognized a familiar scene. Here was this very suite, now occupied by a celebrated actor who was furiously denouncing an unfaithful mistress. So that was how this reception area had been prepared for him. His hosts had based their ideas of terrestrial living upon TV programs. His feeling that he was inside a movie set was almost literally true. He turned off the set and fumbled for the light switch. He was physically and emotionally exhausted. The room was plunged into darkness. Within seconds, he had passed beyond the reach of dreams. So, for the last time, David Bowman slept. There being no further use for it, the furniture of the suite dissolved back into the mind of its creator. Only the bed remained, and the walls, shielding this fragile organism from the energies it could not yet control. In his sleep, David Bowman stirred restlessly. He did not wake, nor did he dream, but he was no longer wholly unconscious. Like a fog creeping through a forest, something invaded his mind. At first it seemed that time itself was running backwards. Even this marvel he was prepared to accept before he realized the subtler truth. The springs of memory were being tapped. In controlled recollection, he was reliving the past. There was the hotel suite, there the space pod, there the burning starscapes of the red sun. His life was unreeling like a tape recorder playing back at ever-increasing speed. Now he was once more aboard Discovery, and the rings of Saturn filled the sky. Before that he was repeating his final dialogue with Hal. He was seeing Frank Poole leave on his last mission. He was hearing the voice of Earth, assuring him that all was well. He was retrogressing down the corridors of time, being drained of knowledge and experience as he swept back towards his childhood. But nothing was being lost. All that he had ever been was being transferred to safer keeping. Even as one David Bowman ceased to exist, another became immortal. Faster, faster he moved back into forgotten years and into a simpler world. Faces he had once loved and had thought lost beyond recall smiled at him sweetly. He smiled back with fondness and without pain. Now at last the wells of memory were nearly dry. Time flowed more and more sluggishly, approaching a moment of stasis, as a swinging pendulum at the limit of its arc seems frozen for one eternal instant before the next cycle begins. The instant passed. The pendulum reversed its swing. In an empty room, floating amid the fires of a star 20,000 light-years from Earth, a baby opened its eyes and began to cry. Then it became silent, as it saw that it was no longer alone. A ghostly, glimmering rectangle had formed in the empty air. It solidified into a crystal tablet, lost its transparency, and became suffused with a pale, milky luminescence. Tantalizing, ill-defined phantoms moved across its surface and in its depths. They coalesced into bars of light and shadow, then formed intermeshing spoked patterns that began slowly to rotate in time with a pulsing rhythm that now seemed to fill the whole of space. With eyes that already held more than human intentness, The baby stared into the depths of the crystal monolith, seeing, but not yet understanding, the mysteries that lay beyond. The metal and plastic of the forgotten space pod, and the clothing once worn by an entity who had called himself David Bowman, flashed into flame. The last links with Earth were gone, resolved back into their component atoms. But the child scarcely noticed, as he adjusted himself to the comfortable glow of his new environment. His indestructible body was his mind's present image of itself, and for all his powers, he knew that he was still a baby. So he would remain until he had decided on a new form, or had passed beyond the necessities of matter. The ancient mechanisms of the Stargate had served him well, but he would not need them again. The glimmering rectangular shape that had once seemed no more than a slab of crystal still floated before him. It encapsulated yet unfathomed secrets of space and time, but some at least he now understood, and was able to command. How obvious, how necessary was that mathematical ratio of its sides, the quadratic sequence 1 to 4 to 9, and how naive to have imagined that the series ended at this point, in only 3 dimensions. He focused his mind upon these geometrical simplicities, and as his thoughts brushed against it, the glow of the red sun faded, and there before him was the luminous whirlpool of the galaxy. If he wished, he could focus his attention upon any one of its 100 billion stars, and he could do much more than that. He was back precisely where he wished to be, in the space that men called real. There before him, a glittering toy no star child could resist, floated the planet Earth with all its peoples. He had returned in time. Down there on that crowded globe, the alarms would be flashing across the radar screens. The great tracking telescopes would be searching the skies, and history, as men knew it, would be drawing to a close. 1,000 miles below, he became aware that a slumbering cargo of death had awoken, and was stirring sluggishly in its orbit. The feeble energies it contained were no possible menace to him, but he preferred a cleaner sky. He put forth his will, and the circling megatons flowered in a silent detonation that brought a brief false dawn to half the sleeping globe. Then he waited, marshalling his thoughts, and brooding over his still untested powers. For though he was master of the world, he was not quite sure what to do next. But he would think of something.
2001, A Space Odyssey was read by William Roberts. The book was written by Arthur C Clarke